Jillian Melchior writes for National Review, is a Thomas L. Rhodes Fellow for the Franklin Center, also a Senior Fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, and she's on the line with us right now, just back from Eastern Europe. Jillian, good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you?
We're doing very well, and thanks for taking time to be on with us this morning.
Oh, happy to do so.
Boy, I was reading about, you with a notebook trying to go through shoe-sucking mud, asking people some questions and all that. It would seem like being anywhere has got to be a nicer change than where you were.
I love just diving into the chaos, so I was pretty happy. I was in my element.
You were all over Eastern Europe, Austria and Serbia and elsewhere. What was the goal of this trip? People perhaps have heard about this refugee crisis and don't know kind of the logistics, the geography. What's happening over there?
Yeah, well, that was kind of what I wanted to answer. And to do so, I wanted to get both the perspective of the countries that were trying to cope with it and the perspective of the people who are actually fleeing and trying to come to Europe. So I spent time in Hungary, which has taken a very hard line on immigration, and Austria, which is trying to figure out sort of how it's going to respond. And then I also spent time in Serbia and Croatia, two countries where a lot of refugees and migrants are coming up through, and spent time interviewing them. And I think I found two things, primarily that an American audience needs to know, and their intention, which makes the story a bit complicated. I think Americans really need to understand the perspective of these refugees, that many of them are moderates, that many of them do want a new life in Europe, and are fleeing for legitimate reasons. That said, I think Americans also need to understand how this is going to impact Europe. We have the biggest population flow into Europe since World War II. We don't know who these people are entirely. Many of them don't have passports or documentation, so there's a huge security risk. In addition to that, this is a Europe that's dealing with financial crises of its own, and this is going to have economic implications. On top of that, you're dealing with a largely Muslim population moving into Europe. Europe has had problems with assimilation, so I think there are some cultural concerns too. So on one hand, it's important to understand that humanitarian aspect of the story, and on the other side, it's really important to understand the political aspect.
And the amount of money that the Germany is going to be shelling out to make sure that people are taken care of until they can be processed, and you can stay and you can't, and you can do. It seems to be a bit of a mess that has some people very upset.
Yeah, that's right. I think people are concerned not only about the so-called push factors, what are driving people out of the Middle East, but they're also concerned about pull factors. And in that, there are concerns that since Germany is offering such generous benefits to asylum seekers, they get housing, they get food assistance, childcare. In some cases, they've gotten cash benefits. They're getting language lessons. I mean, these are huge incentives for people to come to Germany. And then when you pair that with the fact that Germany has essentially suspended the Dublin Agreement for Syrian refugees, giving them special treatment, saying that you don't have to register in the first country you come to, get to Germany and we'll take care of you. I think a lot of European countries are saying that there's a rule of law concern here, that the European Union is not doing what it is supposed to be doing, and that this refugee crisis, already huge, maybe Germany or Sweden's generosity is making it even bigger.
Jillian Melchior with us from National Review, Franklin Center, Independent Women's Forum. You can find her reports at nationalreview.com. Riley and Scott on WROK. Jillian, your first dispatch from Austria, talk about smartphones and social media, and I know you tweeted at some point too. Look, these days, smartphones are not luxuries for these people making the trek. They are necessities. How has that technology changed the way something like this great migration is happening?
Well, it changes everything. Writing about this for an American audience, I know people saw photos of refugees with smartphones and thought, they don't really need help. But if you think about it, this is the most essential tool that you could possibly have during this migration. I mean, you've got routes closing daily. In Croatia, you've got lands that you might be passing through that may still be seeded with landmines. Mm-hmm. It's a way to keep in touch with family back home. It's a way to access your finances. It's a way to figure out what the situation is in your final destination. I mean, this is a critical tool for these people. And one of the things that intrigues me is watching volunteers acknowledge and respond to that. At some of the borders, for example, between Serbia and Croatia, you'd have volunteers giving medical screening, handing out food and water, and then they had stations where people could charge their phones. I talked to a volunteer in Croatia who's been really involved in figuring out a way that people can donate their bandwidth and more people can get online using their smartphones. I think it's something that has totally changed the way that mass migration like this happens. And it's causing problems for the European governments because, bureaucracies are not quite so nimble. You see the migrant populations very quickly figuring out alternative routes. You see the volunteer community mobilizing using technology, and the governments can't quite keep up with it.
It's got to be a weird thing to look at. Okay, we need food, we need water, we need a charging station.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. It was pretty surreal.
You write about an encounter with a guy named Carmen, which I thought was a fascinating look, and then you kind of put a little reveal there at the end of your chat with Carmen.
Yeah, it was one of the stranger things that happened to me there, but I think it illustrates a bigger concern. So basically what happened is I was standing on the border interviewing people. He stopped to talk to me. And I asked him where he was from and why he had left, and he volunteered right away. Oh, I'm from Kobani. That's a Syrian city right on the Turkish border that came under very heavy attack by ISIS last year. Forces defending it were able to finally save the city, but it basically looks like Dresden. I mean, this was the epicenter of the battle pretty recently. So he tells me, oh, I'm from Kobani. I saw a friend drop in front of me. I'm sitting there doing the interview, and his kid is chewing on this animal balloon, and it pops, and it startles all of us. And he goes, oh, yeah, the kids are traumatized. Kobani's boom. So I post a photo of him on my Instagram account along with one of the posts. Well, it turns out I have a lot of friends in Iraq, and they email me right away and say, oh, this guy is actually he's not Syrian, he's not from Kobani. None of that is true. He's an Iraqi journalist who's lost a very well-paying, comfortable job in a relatively safe part of Iraq and is coming to Germany, presumably for the benefits. And I think this illustrates that, Germany offering what it's offering, in addition to giving such great, exceptional treatment to Syrians, has created a situation where there's an incentive for people to say they're Syrian and to lie about it when they're not. I lucked out with this guy because, first of all, I caught him, and second of all, he wasn't dangerous. But I think this really illustrates, as a journalist, we try to fact-check things. I had a lot of people show me ID cards. I had people giving me their full names so I could look at them on social media and verify their identity. But for some of them, it's impossible. And if journalists are struggling with it, the government's certainly struggling with it. And fundamentally, this is a security risk. I mean, we have people coming into Europe without documentation. We don't know who they are. And this is at a time when ISIS is saying that it intends to send people to Europe to carry out terrorism. So I think my small experience illustrates a much broader problem.
Jillian Melchior with us from National Review, the Franklin Center as well. Her reports from Eastern Europe at nationalreview.com. It's Ronnie and Scott on WROK. You mentioned the security concerns. And people are worried about that, and your story, I think, does a good job of explaining why. You can pretend to be someone. Would it be easy? Would it be easy for ISIS fighters to blend in with the crowd, to make their way into Eastern Europe? And I guess secondarily, would it be worthwhile? Meaning, is it worth the slog and through the mud, or given the financial resources ISIS has to their oil sales, would they just find an easier way to do this if they wanted to?
I think it's very likely that this is happening. I mean, we're looking at a population that is pouring into Europe. I will say, after talking to a lot of the refugees, I was struck by how moderate many of them were. I talked to one guy who, he pulled out his phone and showed me a picture of his daughter. She's about 10 years old. And the thing that bothered him, the reason why he was leaving and trying to set up a better life for his family, was because he didn't want her to have to wear a hijab so young. He thought that would deprive her of her childhood. He wanted her to have the opportunity to come out to the West and to get an education and to, live a full life despite being a woman. I met a lot of people like that. But I think we'd be deluding ourselves in saying that everyone that's coming across is like that. I think ISIS sees this probably as a huge opportunity And it is a major security risk. I mean, if you look at what happened with Charlie Hebdo, for instance, the potential of just one or two or three people to, cause a lot of damage. I think it's significant. It's something that we can't ignore.
Well, Jillian, maybe the guy you were just talking about there that showed you pictures of his daughter and how he wanted a better life, or maybe people that you saw that fit the billing as being moderate, maybe they might prove useful in something like this in rooting out some of that as well. If they're legitimately trying to get away and make a better life, they know these guys aren't here to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, in Austria, I spoke to a guy who's really involved in working with migrants. And he was saying that some of them are warning. Some of the refugees are saying not everybody here is good and giving a heads up. So I think it's something that they acknowledge. It's something that we acknowledge. We can't lose sight of this being a humanitarian crisis. But policy-wise, I think many European countries are trying to decide how that humanitarian impulse matches with national interest.
Jillian Melchior with us from National Review, the Franklin Center. Her reports from Eastern Europe, Serbia, Austria, elsewhere at nationalreview.com. Some people have asked, it's a fairly common question I've heard when talking about the crisis, why so many of these migrants are men? Where are the families? Where are some of the children who are coming across? You have an entire post answering that question at nationalreview.com. What did you find?
I do. I think it's an exceptionally important question. And I will say, both the statistics and being on the ground, there are a lot of men coming in. Even though there's a majority of men coming in, that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of women and children. I mean, it was difficult for me to give you some sense to take a photo of male migrants without catching a woman or a child in it. So I think that kind of may help your listeners understand what kind of majority it is. Now, I asked a lot of the male migrants who were traveling by themselves why they were traveling by themselves. Where was their family? Who had they left behind? And the overwhelming answer that I heard was that this is an extremely dangerous journey. I think these men are dealing with a situation that Americans can't understand. There are no good options for them. They can either leave their family behind in a war zone or in a very precarious situation in a refugee camp, or they can entrust their families to smugglers who likely have ties to the criminal underworld. They can take them on basically like an inflatable raft across the ocean to access Europe. We're talking about this in a time where 2,800 people at least have died or gone missing on the Mediterranean route. And then they can entrust themselves to smugglers to get into Northern Europe, Western Europe. I mean, just in August on the Hungarian border, Austrian authorities discovered a truck full of about 70 people who had been shoved into this car by smugglers and had suffocated to death. And the car had just been abandoned. There were rotting bodies in there. So I think what many of these men are hoping to do is come to Europe, get asylum, and spare their family that journey. A lot of them had kind of assessed the situation, decided that it would be safer to do that, to leave their families behind, and then when they got legal status, fly them over.
Is the volume, the flow decreasing as far as you could tell on the ground, or is this going to be an ongoing issue for as long as we can see in the future?
Well, I think there's no end in sight. I mean, it's pretty overwhelming to stand on the border and see literally when we were at the Hungarian-Croatian border, a train pulled up and there were more than 1,300 people. That was one train of many that had come through in a day. Now, to some extent, you're going to see this taper off over the winter. Fewer people are going to make that boat voyage as it gets colder out. And then you've got, winter conditions in the Balkans to contend with. But I think if you're talking about in the long term, I certainly don't see the Middle East becoming a more stable place. I see, especially with Russian intervention, it becoming less stable. I think Putin's pretty aware of that. And I think destabilizing Europe by sending a lot of refugees into it is probably part of his calculation for getting involved in bombing in Syria. So I think, to be honest, there's no end in sight. If you're looking at how many male migrants are coming, and that this is already, in addition to the security concern, providing a financial stress to Europe, and then you consider that for each of those male migrants, they might be bringing a wife, 2 children, 3 children, 4 children, 5 children. I think what we're seeing right now is just the tip of the iceberg.
You're going to want to read Jillian Melchior stuff. Get over to nationalreview.com and check it all out. Jillian, outstanding work as always. Really enjoyed reading what you'd written and look forward to more of it. Thanks for taking time for us.
Thank you so much. And I've got to say a huge thanks to National Review and to the Steamboat Institute for supporting foreign correspondents.